What became of the men who stood closest to Adolf Hitler during the darkest chapter in human history? These were not mere soldiers following orders, but the architects of genocide, the planners of conquest, and the executors of unimaginable atrocities. They dined with Hitler, shaped his policies, commanded his armies, and helped orchestrate the systematic murder of millions. When the Third Reich finally crumbled in May 1945, these powerful figures who had terrorized Europe for over a decade suddenly found themselves hunted, imprisoned, or dead. Some faced justice in historic trials that would define international law for generations. Others escaped through clever maneuvering or died before accountability could reach them. A few vanished into the shadows, living out their days under assumed names. The fates that awaited Hitler's inner circle were as varied as they were dramatic, ranging from the hangman's noose to quiet retirement in comfortable homes. In this video, we will find out what happened to these men after the fall of Nazi Germany. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Hermann Goring was perhaps the most powerful figure in Nazi Germany after Hitler himself. Born into an aristocratic Bavarian family on January 12, 1893, Goring's path to infamy began as a decorated fighter pilot in World War I, where he commanded the famous Richthofen Squadron and earned the prestigious Pour le Mérite Medal. His charisma and military credentials made him an invaluable early supporter of the Nazi Party, participating in the failed Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 alongside Hitler. During this attempt to seize power in Munich, Goring sustained a serious groin injury that required morphine treatment, beginning an addiction that would plague him for the rest of his life. After years in exile following the Putsch, Goring returned to Germany and became one of Hitler's most trusted confidants, rising through the Nazi ranks with remarkable speed. By 1933, he had accumulated an astonishing array of titles and responsibilities, serving simultaneously as Minister-President of Prussia, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and head of the Gestapo during its formative years. His influence extended into nearly every aspect of the Nazi state, from military affairs to economic policy. Goring's role in establishing the Nazi terror apparatus cannot be overstated. In 1933, he founded the first concentration camps in Prussia and created the Gestapo, the secret state police that would become synonymous with Nazi brutality. Though he later transferred control of the Gestapo to Heinrich Himmler, his early work laid the foundation for the surveillance and repression that characterized the Third Reich. As head of the four-year plan from 1936, Goring wielded enormous economic power, directing Germany's preparation for war and enriching himself through the Aryanization process, which involved confiscating Jewish property and businesses. His personal art collection, amassed largely through theft from Jewish families and occupied territories, became one of the largest private collections in Europe. Goring's mansion, Hall, named after his first wife, housed countless stolen masterpieces and served as a monument to his greed and corruption. Despite his military background, Goring proved less competent as a wartime leader. His Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority during the Battle of Britain in 1940, a critical turning point that prevented the invasion of England. The failure was compounded by his inability to adequately supply German forces at Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943, where he had rashly promised Hitler that his air force could keep the encircled Sixth Army supplied through an airlift. As the war turned against Germany, Goring's influence waned dramatically. Hitler increasingly blamed him for the Luftwaffe's failures, particularly as Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities. By 1943, Goring had largely withdrawn from active leadership, spending more time at his various estates and indulging in his morphine addiction. His physical appearance deteriorated significantly, his weight ballooning as he consumed prescription drugs and lived in denial about Germany's impending defeat. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Goring sent a telegram to Hitler from Bavaria, asking permission to assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler was unable to govern from the besieged capital. This message, intended as a reasonable succession plan given the circumstances, was interpreted by Hitler's inner circle, particularly Martin Bormann, as a betrayal and attempted coup. Bormann convinced Hitler that Goring was attempting to usurp power, leading to a furious Hitler stripping Goring of all his titles and ordering his arrest. This final break marked the definitive end of Goring's two-decade relationship with the Führer he had served so faithfully. when American forces captured Goring on May 8, 1945, he expected to be treated as a high-ranking prisoner of war and hoped to negotiate with the Allied leadership. Instead, he was held in custody and eventually indicted as the most senior surviving Nazi leader to stand trial. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, with Goring occupying the first seat in the defendant's dock, a position that reflected his status as the highest-ranking Nazi on trial. He faced 4 counts of charges, including conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Goring proved to be the most formidable defendant during the proceedings, demonstrating sharp intelligence and considerable skill in cross-examination. During his testimony, he denied knowledge of the Holocaust's full extent, while simultaneously defending the Nazi regime's policies and actions. He portrayed himself as a loyal soldier who had simply followed his duty to Germany, attempting to separate military decisions from genocidal policies. The prosecution, however, presented extensive documentation linking Goring directly to the final solution, including his signature on documents ordering the persecution of Jews and his role in establishing the concentration camp system. Throughout the trial, Goring maintained a defiant attitude, refusing to show remorse for his actions. He saw himself as a representative of Germany, rather than a criminal, and his behaviour in court reflected this self-perception. Fellow defendants often looked to him for leadership, and he worked behind the scenes to coordinate defence strategies and maintain unity among the accused. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal found Hermann Goring guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. The sentence was scheduled to be carried out on October 16, 1946, alongside other condemned Nazi leaders. However, Goring would never face the hangman's noose. On the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, he committed suicide in his cell by biting into a cyanide capsule he had somehow managed to conceal from his guards throughout his imprisonment. The source of the poison remains a mystery to this day, with theories ranging from a sympathetic guard to his having hidden it in his belongings from the time of his capture. His final letter, addressed to the Nuremberg commandant, stated that he chose to die by his own hand as a German officer rather than be executed as a common criminal. Goring's death robbed the Allied powers of the opportunity to execute the most prominent surviving Nazi leader, though it did little to diminish the impact of the Nuremberg verdicts. His wife Emmy and daughter Edda were left to navigate life with the Goring name, facing years of financial hardship and social stigma as they tried to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. Heinrich Himmler was the mastermind behind the Holocaust and one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany. Born on October 7, 1900 in Munich to a middle-class Catholic family, nothing in his early life suggested the monstrous role he would later play in history. His father was a schoolteacher and strict disciplinarian, and young Heinrich grew up as a quiet, studious child with poor eyesight and a weak constitution. He served briefly in the final months of World War I, but never saw combat, a fact that would later fuel his obsession with proving his martial prowess. After the war, Himmler studied agriculture and worked on a chicken farm, developing an interest in animal breeding that would grotesquely manifest later in his racial theories about human genetics. He joined the Nazi Party in 1923 and participated in the Beer Hall Putsch, though in a minor role. His organizational skills and fanatical devotion to Hitler caught the attention of party leadership, and in 1929, Hitler appointed him Reichsführer SS, leader of the Schutzstaffel, which at that time numbered only 280 men. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS would grow into a vast empire of terror, eventually numbering over 800,000 members and controlling concentration camps, death squads, and significant portions of the German economy. Himmler transformed the SS from Hitler's personal bodyguard into the most powerful organization in Nazi Germany, responsible for internal security, racial policy enforcement, and the implementation of the final solution. He established the first purpose-built concentration camp at Dachau in 1933, setting a template that would be replicated across occupied Europe. His obsession with racial purity led him to create the Lebensborn program, which encouraged SS officers to father children with racially pure women, and he personally oversaw the development of pseudo-scientific racial classification systems. Himmler's power reached its zenith when he gained control of the Gestapo in 1934. Giving him command over all of Germany's police forces. This, Consolidation of power made him second only to Hitler in the Nazi hierarchy, and he used this position to ruthlessly eliminate enemies of the regime, both real and imagined. During the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, Himmler's SS played a crucial role in murdering the leadership of the SA, the party's original paramilitary wing, cementing the SS's position as the primary instrument of Nazi terror. His meticulous record-keeping and bureaucratic approach to mass murder would later provide prosecutors with extensive documentation of Nazi crimes. The implementation of the final solution was Himmler's most heinous achievement. In 1941, he received Hitler's authorization to begin the systematic extermination of European Jewry, and he approached this genocidal task with horrifying efficiency. Himmler personally attended executions carried out by Einsatzgruppen, death squads on the Eastern Front, though witnesses noted he appeared physically disturbed by the experience. This led him to seek more humane methods for the killers rather than the victims, resulting in the development of gas chambers and the industrial murder apparatus of camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Under his direction, the SS murdered approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology, including Roma, homosexuals, disabled individuals, and political opponents. Himmler visited concentration camps regularly, inspecting operations and ensuring quotas were met with the same detached efficiency he might have applied to managing a factory. His daughter Gudrun, whom he called Pupi, sometimes accompanied him on official functions, though she was carefully shielded from the true nature of her father's work. Himmler maintained a facade of bourgeois respectability, presenting himself as a devoted family man even as he ordered unimaginable atrocities. His diaries reveal a man consumed by mundane administrative details, treating genocide as simply another bureaucratic challenge to be managed efficiently. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in late 1944 and early 1945, Himmler's loyalty to Hitler began to waver. Recognizing that defeat was inevitable, he initiated secret negotiations with the Western Allies through Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, offering to surrender German forces in exchange for lenient treatment. When Hitler learned of these treacherous negotiations in April 1945, he flew into a rage, stripping Himmler of all his positions and ordering his arrest. However, with the Reich collapsing around them, this order could not be enforced. Himmler attempted to escape by disguising himself as a common soldier, shaving his moustache and wearing an eye patch to alter his distinctive appearance. On May 21, 1945, British soldiers stopped him at a checkpoint near Bremerwörde in northern Germany. Initially, the guards did not recognize the mild-mannered man carrying forged identification papers, but Himmler's nervous behavior aroused suspicion. During questioning, he revealed his true identity, apparently hoping that his attempt at negotiation with the Allies might earn him some consideration. The British immediately placed him under arrest, but before he could be properly interrogated, Himmler requested to change into his own clothes. During this brief moment of reduced surveillance on May 23, 1945, Heinrich Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule he had concealed in his mouth, dying within minutes, despite frantic efforts to save him. His death came just 2 weeks after Germany's surrender and robbed the world of the opportunity to see him face justice at Nuremberg. The architect of the Holocaust, the man responsible for more deaths than perhaps any other individual in history save Hitler himself, escaped accountability through suicide. British authorities buried his body in an unmarked grave in a secret location to prevent it from becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. His wife, Margareta, and daughter Gudrun survived the war and were briefly detained by Allied forces, but both maintained their devotion to Himmler's memory until their deaths decades later. Gudrun, in particular, became an active supporter of organizations helping former SS members, never accepting the truth about her father's crimes and insisting until her death in 2018 that he had been murdered by the British rather than having committed suicide. Joseph Goebbels served as Hitler's Minister of Propaganda and was arguably the most talented manipulator of public opinion in the Nazi hierarchy. Born on October 29, 1897, in Reit, Germany, to a working-class Catholic family, Goebbels suffered from a congenital foot deformity that left him with a clubfoot and a permanent limp, an imperfection that caused him deep shame in a regime that celebrated physical perfection. This disability exempted him from military service in World War I, leading him to pursue higher education instead. He earned a doctorate in German literature from Heidelberg University in 1921, which explains his insistence on being addressed as Dr. Goebbels throughout his life. Initially, Goebbels harbored literary ambitions, writing plays and novels that were universally rejected by publishers, feeding a growing resentment toward the established cultural elite. This rejection, combined with the economic chaos of Weimar Germany, drove him toward extremist politics. He joined the Nazi Party in 1924 and quickly distinguished himself as a gifted speaker and writer, catching Hitler's attention with his fierce loyalty and propaganda skills. By 1926, Hitler appointed him Gauleiter of Berlin, tasking him with winning over the traditionally left-wing capital to the Nazi cause. Goebbels approached his propaganda work with a sophistication that set him apart from other Nazi leaders. He understood mass psychology and modern media in ways his contemporaries did not, pioneering techniques of political messaging that would influence propaganda methods for decades to come. As propaganda minister from 1933 until the regime's end in 1945, he controlled all aspects of German cultural life, from newspapers and radio to film and theatre. Goebbels organized massive rallies like the annual Nuremberg Party Congresses, creating spectacles designed to overwhelm individual thought and foster collective emotion. His ministry produced the infamous film The Eternal Jew, a vile piece of anti-Semitic propaganda that depicted Jews as subhuman, helping to psychologically prepare the German population for the Holocaust. Goebbels was instrumental in organizing Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9, 1938. When Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues across Germany. His diary entries reveal he viewed this pogrom as a successful demonstration of popular anti-Semitism, though in reality it was carefully orchestrated by the Nazi Party apparatus. Throughout the war, Goebbels maintained an illusion of German invincibility through carefully controlled news reporting, only gradually admitting setbacks when they became impossible to conceal. His personal life was marked by hypocrisy and scandal. Despite promoting traditional family values and denouncing moral degeneracy, Goebbels engaged in numerous extramarital affairs, most notably with Czech actress Lida Barova in 1938. This relationship became so serious that Goebbels considered divorcing his wife Magda, but Hitler personally intervened, ordering him to end the affair and remain married to preserve the image of Nazi moral superiority. Magda Goebbels herself was a complex figure who had been an early and devoted Nazi supporter, even before meeting Joseph. She became known as the First Lady of the Third Reich and gave birth to 6 children, all of whose names began with H in honor of Hitler, who served as godfather to several of them. The children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda and Haida, were often featured in propaganda depicting ideal Aryan family life. As the war progressed and Germany faced increasing defeats, Goebbels doubled down on his propaganda efforts, coining the term total war in a famous 1943 speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, where he whipped the crowd into a frenzy of fanatical determination. He remained absolutely loyal to Hitler, even as other Nazi leaders began to waver or seek escape routes. In the final days of April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Goebbels moved his entire family into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery to remain with Hitler until the end. While many other Nazi leaders fled or attempted to negotiate surrenders, Goebbels saw himself as honor-bound to stay with the Führer. He was present in the bunker on April 30th, 1945, when Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide, and according to Hitler's will, Goebbels was appointed Reich Chancellor, though this title was meaningless with the Reich in its final hours of existence. On May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's death, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made a horrifying decision that would define their legacy. They had an SS doctor sedate their 6 young children, aged 4 to 12, and then murdered them by crushing cyanide capsules in their mouths as they slept. Magda personally participated in killing her own children, apparently convinced that they could not survive in a world without National Socialism, and that death was preferable to living in shame as the offspring of prominent Nazis. After murdering their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went up to the Reich Chancellery garden. where they committed suicide, either by shooting themselves or taking cyanide, with contradictory accounts from witnesses. Their bodies were partially burned by SS men, but not as thoroughly as Hitler's had been, and were later discovered by Soviet troops. Unlike most other Nazi leaders, Goebbels and his wife chose death over capture, and they took their innocent children with them into the void. The discovery of the Goebbels children's bodies shocked even hardened Soviet soldiers who had witnessed countless horrors during the war. The family's end represented the complete bankruptcy of Nazi ideology, a movement that had promised to create a 1,000-year Reich but instead destroyed everything it touched, including its own most devoted adherents. Martin Bormann was perhaps the least publicly known but most powerful member of Hitler's inner circle. Born on June 17, 1900 in Halberstadt, Germany, to a Lutheran family of modest means, Bormann's early life gave no indication of the extraordinary power he would later wield. He briefly served in the army at the end of World War I, but saw no combat. After the war, he joined the Free Corps, right-wing paramilitary groups, and became involved in violent nationalist politics. In 1924, Bormann participated in the murder of his elementary school teacher, Walter Kadau, whom he and others believed had betrayed Leo Schlageter to French occupation authorities. Bormann was convicted of murder and served a year in prison, a crime that paradoxically enhanced his standing in Nazi circles, where violence against perceived enemies was celebrated. He joined the Nazi Party in 1927 and began working in its administrative apparatus, demonstrating an exceptional talent for bureaucratic manipulation and backroom dealings. Unlike the bombastic speakers and charismatic leaders who dominated the early Nazi Party, Bormann was quiet, methodical, and nearly invisible to the public. This anonymity proved to be his greatest asset, allowing him to accumulate power while others competed for Hitler's attention through grand gestures and public displays. Bormann's rise to power accelerated when he became chief of staff to Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, in 1933. In this role, Bormann controlled access to Hess and learned the inner workings of the Nazi power structure. When Hess flew to Scotland on his unauthorized peace mission in 1941, Bormann moved swiftly to fill the power vacuum, ensuring that Hitler would not appoint another deputy, but would instead rely directly on Bormann himself. Hitler appointed him head of the party chancellery and his personal secretary, positions that gave Bormann control over Hitler's schedule, access, and information flow. No document reached Hitler without passing through Bormann's hands first, and no decision left the Führer's headquarters without Bormann's involvement in its implementation. He carefully cultivated his relationship with Hitler, making himself indispensable by handling administrative details that the Führer found tedious. Bormann attended every meeting, took meticulous notes, and transformed Hitler's often vague pronouncements into concrete orders and policies. This role made him the gatekeeper to Hitler's power, and other Nazi leaders soon learned that they needed Bormann's favor to achieve their goals. He used this position ruthlessly, maintaining extensive files on potential rivals and manipulating information to ensure his own preeminence. Bormann was particularly hostile to Goring and played a key role in convincing Hitler that Goring's 1945 telegram was a betrayal, leading to Goring's downfall. Bormann was deeply involved in implementing Nazi racial policies and the Holocaust. He signed numerous orders relating to the persecution of Jews, the confiscation of Jewish property, and the administration of occupied territories. In the Eastern Territories, he advocated for harsh measures against the Slavic population, whom he viewed as inferior and deserving only of slavery or death. Bormann's ideological commitment to Nazism was absolute, driven by a fanaticism that surpassed even that of many veteran party members. He amassed considerable personal wealth through corruption, taking bribes and skimming funds from various Nazi organizations. His personal life reflected his devotion to Nazi racial ideology. He married Gerda Buch in 1929, and together they had 10 children, whom Bormann saw as his contribution to creating the Aryan master race. His letters to his wife, which survived the war, reveal a man completely immersed in Nazi ideology, discussing racial theory and party politics with equal enthusiasm. Remarkably, Gerda Bormann tolerated and even encouraged her husband's relationship with actress Manja Behrens, with whom he had 2 additional children. The arrangement reflected the Nazi elite's hypocritical attitude toward traditional morality, where powerful men could engage in behavior they condemned in others. In the final months of the war, Bormann remained in the Führer bunker with Hitler, refusing to leave despite the hopeless military situation. He was present at Hitler's wedding to Eva Braun on April 29, 1945, serving as one of the witnesses. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Bormann was named executor of his will and witnessed Goebbels' suicide the following day. On the night of May 1st, 1945, Bormann attempted to escape from the bunker along with other Nazi officials as Soviet forces overran Berlin. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in various locations during the chaotic breakout attempt, but accounts of his final fate contradicted each other for decades. Some claimed he died crossing the Weidendammer Bridge after a German tank he was following was hit by Soviet fire. Others reported seeing him alive after that point. For nearly 30 years, Martin Bormann's fate remained one of World War II's greatest mysteries. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg in 1946 and convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, receiving a death sentence that could not be carried out since his location was unknown. Reports of Bormann's sightings came from around the world, particularly from South America, where Nazi fugitives had indeed established hiding places. Nazi hunters pursued leads on Bormann for decades, convinced he had escaped like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele. The mystery was finally solved in 1972 when construction workers in Berlin discovered human remains near the Lehrter station, close to where Bormann was last seen in 1945. Dental records and forensic analysis identified one set of remains as Bormann's, and soil samples from his teeth contained glass fragments consistent with biting a cyanide capsule. DNA testing conducted in 1998 definitively confirmed the identification. It appeared that Bormann had indeed died in Berlin on May 1st or 2nd, 1945, likely by suicide when his escape route was cut off. However, the confirmation of his death did little to diminish his historical significance. Bormann's widow Gerda died in 1946, and their 10 children were scattered among relatives and orphanages. His eldest son, Martin Bormann Jr., later became a Catholic priest and missionary, completely renouncing his father's ideology, though he was later accused of abuse during his time working with youth. The younger Bormann's attempt to atone for his father's sins through religious service represented a stark contrast to children of other Nazi leaders who defended their parents. Albert Speer presented himself as the good Nazi, but this carefully cultivated image obscured his deep complicity in the regime's crimes. Born on March 19, 1905, in Mannheim to an affluent family of architects, Speer enjoyed a privileged upbringing that included university education and professional training in architecture. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931, motivated more by career ambition than ideological conviction, though he would later claim political naivete. His architectural skills quickly caught Hitler's attention, leading to commissions to redesign party buildings and later to grand projects intended to reshape Berlin into Germania, the capital of a 1,000-year Reich. Hitler, who harbored frustrated artistic ambitions, found in Speer a kindred spirit who could realize his grandiose visions in stone and steel. Speer's designs embodied Nazi aesthetics on a monumental scale, intended to awe viewers into submission before the power of the state. His most famous work, the Zeppelinfeld Stadium in Nuremberg, where Hitler delivered speeches to massive crowds, created a theatrical setting that enhanced Nazi spectacles. Speer also developed the Cathedral of Light, using searchlights to create vertical columns of light during nighttime rallies, an innovation that became iconic in Nazi imagery. When Fritz Tott, the Minister of Armaments, died in a plane crash in 1942, Hitler appointed Speer to replace him. This promotion transformed Speer from an architect into one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi war machine. He proved devastatingly effective in this role, reorganizing German war production with remarkable efficiency despite Allied bombing campaigns and resource shortages. Under his leadership, armaments production tripled between 1942 and 1944, keeping Germany fighting long after its defeat should have been apparent. This achievement, however, came at a terrible human cost. Speer's production increases relied heavily on slave labor from concentration camps and occupied territories, with millions of people worked to death in mines, factories, and construction sites. He personally toured facilities using forced labor and made decisions about production quotas, knowing that workers were being treated as expendable resources. Speer maintained a careful distance from the most visible atrocities, avoiding visits to extermination camps and claiming ignorance of the Holocaust's full extent, but his position made such ignorance impossible to believe. Documents revealed after the war showed he attended conferences where the use of concentration camp labor was discussed in detail, and he actively requested additional slave workers to meet production goals. As Germany's military position became hopeless in early 1945, Speer began to distance himself from Hitler psychologically, if not physically. He later claimed that he had even planned to assassinate Hitler by introducing poison gas into the Führer bunker's ventilation system, though this story, like many of Speer's post-war claims, lacks corroborating evidence and may have been fabricated to enhance his image as a resistor. What is certain is that Speer defied Hitler's Nero decree in March 1945, which ordered the destruction of German infrastructure to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. Speer worked behind the scenes to prevent implementation of this scorched earth policy, saving bridges, factories, and utilities that would be needed for Germany's post-war recovery. This action, while beneficial, came only when Germany's defeat was inevitable, and Speer was positioning himself for survival in a post-Nazi world. He remained with Hitler in Berlin until late April 1945, making a final visit to the Führer bunker on April 23rd, before fleeing to Hamburg, where he was captured by British forces on May 23rd, 1945. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer adopted a unique strategy among the defendants by accepting general responsibility for the Nazi regime's crimes, while denying specific knowledge of the Holocaust. He admitted that as a member of Hitler's government, he bore collective guilt for what had happened, but he carefully avoided admitting to actions that would make him personally liable for specific war crimes. This calculated admission of responsibility, combined with his educated demeanour and apparent contrition, convinced many that he was different from his co-defendants. Speer claimed he had been apolitical, focused solely on architecture and technical matters, seduced by Hitler's charisma, but ignorant of the regime's true nature. This narrative was largely false, as abundant evidence showed Speer was deeply involved in policy decisions and fully aware of the regime's criminal activities. Nevertheless, his performance at Nuremberg was so convincing that he escaped the death penalty, receiving instead a 20-year prison sentence. He served his full term at Spandau prison in Berlin, using the time to write extensive memoirs that further refined his image as the remorseful technocrat. His books, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau: The Secret Diaries, became international bestsellers after his release in 1966, making him wealthy and establishing him as a sought-after commentator on the Nazi period. Speer spent his final years giving interviews, appearing in documentaries, and carefully managing his public image while continuing to deny full knowledge of the Holocaust. He died of a stroke on September 1st, 1981, in London, while visiting his mistress, maintaining his constructed persona until the end. Historical scholarship has since thoroughly dismantled the good Nazi myth Speer created, with researchers documenting his direct involvement in selecting forced labourers, his knowledge of their treatment, and his presence at meetings where genocide was discussed. His children had mixed relationships with his legacy. His son Albert Speer Jr. became a successful architect himself, but insisted his career choice was independent of his father's influence, and he spent his life trying to distance himself from the Speer name. The younger Albert died in 2017, having never fully escaped the shadow of his father's crimes. Speer's case demonstrates how post-war narratives could be constructed by intelligent, articulate Nazi leaders to minimize their culpability and rehabilitate their reputations, a process that has implications for how we remember and judge historical figures. Rudolf Hess held the title of Deputy Führer and was one of Hitler's oldest and most devoted followers. Born on April 26, 1894, in Alexandria, Egypt, to a German merchant family, Hess spent his childhood in Egypt before being sent to boarding school in Germany. He served with distinction in World War I, first in the infantry and later in the Imperial German Air Service as a fighter pilot. After the war, Hess studied geopolitics at the University of Munich, where he fell under the influence of Professor Karl Haushofer, whose theories about Lebensraum, or living space, would later influence Nazi foreign policy. Hess met Hitler in 1920 and became an early convert to the Nazi cause, participating in the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. When the putsch failed and Hitler was imprisoned at Landsberg prison, Hess voluntarily joined him there, serving as his secretary and helping to transcribe Mein Kampf. This period of close collaboration cemented Hess's position as one of Hitler's most trusted confidants. After their release, Hess became Hitler's private secretary and steadily rose through the party ranks, eventually being named Deputy Führer in 1933, making him second in the line of succession after Goering. Despite his high rank, Hess's actual power diminished over time as more dynamic figures like Goebbels, Himmler, and Bormann gained influence. Hess was deeply interested in alternative medicine, astrology, and occult practices, beliefs that sometimes made him a figure of mockery among other Nazi leaders who saw him as eccentric and out of touch. His devotion to Hitler bordered on the obsessive, and he struggled to find meaningful work as the war progressed, and Hitler increasingly relied on others for military and political advice. By 1941, Hess had been effectively sidelined from real decision-making, though he retained his titles and ceremonial roles. On the night of May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess undertook an action that would define his legacy and perplex historians for decades. He secretly flew a Messerschmitt Bf 110 from Augsburg to Scotland, parachuting into a field near Glasgow where he demanded to meet the Duke of Hamilton, whom he believed would help him negotiate peace between Britain and Germany. Hess apparently believed that Britain would agree to peace if Germany guaranteed the British Empire's integrity, allowing Hitler to focus entirely on his planned invasion of the Soviet Union without fighting a two-front war. The mission was undertaken entirely on Hess's own initiative, without Hitler's knowledge or approval. The British immediately imprisoned Hess, treating him as a prisoner of war rather than a diplomatic envoy. Hitler was stunned and furious when he learned of Hess's flight, publicly declaring him insane and stripping him of all party positions. The Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive to explain away Hess's embarrassing defection, claiming he had suffered hallucinations and mental delusions. Whether Hess was indeed mentally unbalanced or simply desperately misguided in believing he could single-handedly negotiate peace remains debated. British intelligence extensively interrogated Hess, but found him useless as a source of military information and uninteresting as a propaganda tool once it became clear he had no authority to negotiate. He spent the remainder of the war in British captivity, held at various facilities and subjected to psychiatric evaluation. At the Nuremberg trials, Hess presented a pathetic figure, claiming amnesia and struggling to understand the proceedings. He was convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy to wage aggressive war, but acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as he had been in British custody during the period when most Nazi atrocities were committed. He received a life sentence. Hess was transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he would spend the next 46 years of his life. For the final 20 years, he was Spandau's sole prisoner, as the other inmates who had been sentenced there were gradually released or died. The four powers controlling Berlin, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, jointly administered the prison, and the Soviet Union consistently vetoed any proposals for Hess's early release despite his advanced age and deteriorating health. His son, Wolf Hess, campaigned tirelessly for his father's release, gathering thousands of signatures and lobbying political leaders, but the Soviets remained adamant that Hess must serve his full life sentence. On August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, Rudolf Hess was found dead in a summer house in the prison garden, an electrical cord wrapped around his neck in an apparent suicide. The official conclusion was that the elderly prisoner had hanged himself, but the circumstances surrounding his death sparked conspiracy theories that persist to this day. His family insisted he was murdered to prevent him from being released or from revealing secrets about his 1941 flight. However, no credible evidence supports these theories, and the overwhelming likelihood is that Hess, facing the prospect of dying in prison, chose to end his life on his own terms. His death led to the demolition of Spandau prison to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Hess's wife Ilse, whom he had married in 1927 with Hitler serving as a witness, died in 1995, having spent decades defending her husband's reputation and denying the Nazi regime's crimes. Wilhelm Keitel served as chief of the Armed Forces High Command and was among Hitler's most subservient military officers. Born on September 22, 1882 in Helmscherode, Germany, to a middle-class landowning family, Keitel pursued a military career from an early age, joining the Imperial German Army in 1901. He served primarily in staff and artillery positions during World War I, demonstrating competent organizational skills but never commanding troops in combat. During the Weimar Republic years, Keitel continued his military career in the reduced Reichswehr, steadily advancing through staff positions that emphasized administration over battlefield leadership. His appointment as head of the Armed Forces High Command in 1938 came not because of his military genius, but because Hitler wanted a compliant subordinate who would not challenge his decisions. Other senior officers, derisively, called him Lacketel, a play on his name combining it with the German word for lackey, reflecting his servile attitude toward Hitler. Keitel eagerly facilitated Hitler's increasing control over military operations, transforming the High Command into a rubber stamp for the Führer's often disastrous strategic decisions. Throughout World War II, Keitel demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Hitler, defending even the most questionable orders and strategies. He was present at most major military conferences and signed numerous criminal orders, including the Commissar Order, directing the immediate execution of Soviet political officers, and the Night and Fog Decree, mandating the secret arrest and disappearance of resistance members in occupied territories. Keitel's signature appeared on orders implementing the Barbarossa Decree, which suspended legal protections for Soviet civilians and authorized extreme violence by German troops. He was also instrumental in drafting orders for the murder of British commandos captured behind German lines. Despite holding the rank of Field Marshal, Keitel never commanded troops in the field during World War II, spending the entire war at Hitler's headquarters, issuing orders conceived by others. His military colleagues held him in contempt, viewing him as a glorified clerk rather than a genuine military leader. When officers attempted to include him in the July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, they were told Keitel was too slavishly devoted to the Führer to even consider such treason. Indeed, when the bomb exploded at Hitler's field headquarters, Keitel was present and survived with minor injuries. In the aftermath, he zealously participated in the purge of suspected conspirators, serving on a court of honor that expelled hundreds of officers from the Wehrmacht so they could be tried and executed by civilian courts. Keitel remained with Hitler until the very end, present in the Führer bunker during the final days of April 1945. On May 8, 1945, he represented the German High Command in signing the final instrument of surrender in Berlin to Soviet forces, officially ending Germany's participation in World War II. The Soviets arrested him immediately afterward, and he was transferred to Allied custody for trial at Nuremberg. During the proceedings, Keitel cut a pathetic figure, admitting his actions while attempting to justify them through claims of military necessity and obedience to orders. Unlike many defendants who denied knowledge of Nazi crimes, Keitel acknowledged his role in issuing criminal orders, but argued he had no choice but to follow Hitler's directives. This defense of superior orders had been explicitly rejected in the Nuremberg Charter, which held individuals responsible for war crimes regardless of whether they were following orders. The prosecution presented extensive documentation of Keitel's involvement in planning aggressive wars and implementing criminal policies. His own signature appeared on orders directing the murder of prisoners, the mistreatment of slave laborers, and the terrorizing of civilian populations in occupied territories. The tribunal found Wilhelm Keitel guilty on all 4 counts, including crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging on October 1, 1946. Despite his military rank, Keitel's request to be executed by firing squad rather than hanging was denied, as the tribunal ruled that his crimes warranted the same method of execution used for common criminals. On October 16, 1946, Keitel was led to the gallows in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. His last words were reportedly, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." The execution was botched, with Keitel strangling slowly rather than dying instantly from a broken neck, taking several agonizing minutes to die. His body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in a river to prevent any grave from becoming a memorial site. Keitel's wife and family endured years of hardship and social ostracism after his execution, though they never faced formal prosecution. His role as Hitler's most compliant general serves as a cautionary tale about military officers who subordinate professional judgment and ethical responsibility to political loyalty. Alfred Jodl served as Chief of Operations Staff of the Wehrmacht High Command throughout World War II, making him one of Hitler's principal military advisors. Born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, Bavaria, Jodl came from a military family and entered the Bavarian army as an artillery officer in 1910. He served with distinction during World War I, demonstrating tactical ability and a talent for staff work. During the interwar period, Jodl became a dedicated Nazi, thoroughly convinced of the correctness of Hitler's worldview and committed to the regime's goals. Unlike some professional officers who maintained a certain distance from Nazi ideology, Jodl embraced it wholeheartedly, believing that Germany's military resurgence under Hitler represented a restoration of national greatness. His appointment to the operations staff brought him into close daily contact with Hitler, and he became one of the few military officers whose advice the Führer valued and occasionally heeded. Jodl was present at virtually all major military conferences during the war, helping to translate Hitler's strategic visions into operational orders. He participated in planning the invasions of Poland, Norway, France, and the Soviet Union, demonstrating considerable strategic acumen even when working with Hitler's sometimes fantastical demands. Jodl's signature appeared on some of the Wehrmacht's most notorious criminal orders. He drafted and transmitted the Commando Order of October 1942, which directed German forces to execute Allied commandos even if they attempted to surrender. This order led to the murder of numerous British, American, and other Allied Special Forces personnel captured behind German lines. Jodl also played a role in implementing the Commissar Order and signed directives for harsh anti-partisan operations that resulted in mass murder of civilians in occupied territories. Unlike some generals who claim they merely transmitted orders without supporting them, evidence suggests Jodl genuinely believed in the necessity of these harsh measures. His wartime diaries and correspondence reveal a man convinced that total war justified extreme methods, including terrorism against civilian populations and the murder of prisoners who were deemed dangerous or inconvenient. He argued that partisan resistance in occupied territories warranted collective punishment of local populations, a position that violated established laws of war. Despite his ideological commitment, Jodl occasionally clashed with Hitler over military strategy, particularly in the war's final years when Germany's position became hopeless. He advocated for withdrawals and consolidations that Hitler rejected as defeatist, leading to heated arguments that temporarily damaged their relationship. However, Jodl always ultimately submitted to Hitler's will, implementing orders he knew were militarily unsound. On May 7, 1945, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces to the Western Allies at General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, formally ending the European War. He was immediately arrested, along with other members of the Flensburg government that had briefly succeeded Hitler. At Nuremberg, Jodl mounted a more vigorous defense than many other defendants, arguing that, as a military officer, he had no choice but to follow orders from his supreme commander. He claimed that many of the orders bearing his signature were dictated by Hitler, and that his role was merely to formalize and transmit them. This defense impressed no one, as the evidence clearly showed Jodl was an active participant in planning and implementing criminal policies, rather than a reluctant intermediary. The prosecution documented his involvement in ordering deportations of Danish citizens to concentration camps, including Jewish residents, and his role in developing plans for the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. Witnesses testified that Jodl had defended the execution of captured commandos as militarily necessary and legally justified under his interpretation of the laws of war. His justifications for the Commissar Order were particularly chilling, as he argued that Soviet political officers were not protected by the Geneva Convention because the Soviet Union allegedly did not adhere to civilized warfare standards. The International Military Tribunal found Alfred Jodl guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment and sentenced him to death by hanging on October 1, 1946. He maintained his dignity throughout the trial and showed no remorse for his actions, believing to the end that he had faithfully served Germany. On October 16, 1946, Jodl was hanged at Nuremberg prison. His final words were, "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," meaning, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." In a controversial post-war development, a German denazification court posthumously exonerated Jodl in 1953, ruling that following orders was an acceptable defence and that he had merely performed his duty as a soldier. This verdict was widely condemned by Allied governments and war crimes experts, and it was later nullified by German authorities who recognised it as an inappropriate rehabilitation of a convicted war criminal. The attempt to exonerate Jodl reflected broader tensions in 1950s West Germany between the need to reintegrate the military establishment and the obligation to maintain accountability for war crimes. Jodl's widow Louisa fought for decades to clear her husband's name, arguing he was merely a professional soldier caught up in political events beyond his control. Her efforts gained some sympathy in Cold War West Germany, where former Wehrmacht officers were being recruited for the new Bundeswehr, and a narrative emerged portraying the professional military as separate from the Nazi regime's crimes. However, historical scholarship has conclusively demonstrated that Jodl was a committed Nazi who actively participated in criminal operations, making such rehabilitation efforts historically indefensible. Karl Donitz commanded Germany's U-boat fleet and became Hitler's designated successor in the final days of the war. Born on September 16, 1891, in Grünau near Berlin, Donitz joined the Imperial German Navy in 1910 and served on U-boats during World War I. He was captured when his submarine was sunk in 1918 and spent the remainder of the war as a British prisoner. This experience left him with a deep understanding of submarine warfare and an enduring hostility toward Britain. During the interwar years, Donitz remained in the Navy and became a vocal advocate for rebuilding Germany's U-boat fleet, which had been banned under the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler repudiated the treaty and began rearming Germany, Donitz emerged as the natural choice to command the expanding submarine force. He developed the Wolfpack tactics that would prove devastatingly effective in the early years of World War II, coordinating multiple U-boats to attack Allied convoys. Under his leadership, German submarines sank thousands of Allied merchant ships in what became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, bringing Britain close to starvation and threatening to cut off American supplies to Europe. Donitz was a committed Nazi who shared Hitler's worldview and expressed anti-Semitic views in speeches to his men. He encouraged his U-boat commanders to show no mercy to survivors of sunken ships, and in 1942 he issued orders discouraging the rescue of shipwreck victims, arguing that such humanitarian concerns undermined the effectiveness of submarine warfare. While he stopped short of ordering the direct murder of survivors, his policies created conditions where many Allied sailors died unnecessarily after their ships were sunk. Donitz's relationship with Hitler strengthened as the war progressed, particularly after he replaced Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in 1943. Hitler appreciated Donitz's aggressive attitude and unwavering loyalty, qualities in short supply among senior military officers by the war's later years. Unlike army generals who increasingly questioned Hitler's strategic decisions, Donitz remained supportive and optimistic, promising new wonder weapons and tactics that would turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. In reality, by mid-1943, the Allies had gained the upper hand through improved convoy tactics, radar technology, and code-breaking, leading to catastrophic losses among German U-boats. However, Donitz continued to send young submariners to their deaths in increasingly hopeless missions rather than admit defeat. In late April 1945, as Soviet forces surrounded Berlin and Hitler prepared for suicide, the Führer made a shocking decision. Rather than designating Goring, Himmler, or any of the senior Nazi Party leaders as his successor, Hitler chose Karl Donitz to become President of Germany and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. This choice reflected Hitler's contempt for party officials who he felt had betrayed him, while Donitz had remained loyal to the end. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide and Donitz assumed leadership of what remained of the Third Reich. From his headquarters in Flensburg in northern Germany, Donitz formed what became known as the Flensburg government, attempting to negotiate a partial surrender to Western allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. He hoped to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity, facilitating the escape of military units and refugees westward. However, the Allies insisted on unconditional surrender on all fronts, rejecting Donitz's attempts to negotiate separate terms. On May 7 and 8, 1945, representatives of Donitz's government signed unconditional surrender documents, ending the war in Europe. The Allies allowed Donitz's government to continue functioning for several weeks to facilitate the orderly surrender and demobilization of German forces, but on May 23, 1945, British forces arrested Dönitz and his cabinet, dissolving the government. At the Nuremberg trials, Donitz faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution emphasized his role in conducting unrestricted submarine warfare and his orders discouraging the rescue of survivors, which they argued constituted war crimes. His defense argued that submarine warfare was a legitimate military tactic and that Allied naval forces had employed similar methods, even calling American Admiral Chester Nimitz as a witness who admitted that U.S. submarines in the Pacific had conducted unrestricted warfare against Japan. This testimony significantly undermined the prosecution's case regarding submarine warfare, though it did not address Dönitz's other crimes. The tribunal acquitted Dönitz of crimes against humanity, but convicted him of crimes against peace for his participation in planning and executing aggressive war, and war crimes for his harsh treatment of survivors and his role in the Nazi war effort. On October 3, 1946, he received a sentence of 10 years imprisonment, the lightest sentence given to any defendant convicted on multiple counts. Dönitz served his full sentence at Spandau prison, refusing to express remorse or acknowledge the criminality of the Nazi regime. He was released on October 1, 1956, having served exactly 10 years. After his release, Dönitz lived quietly in a village near Hamburg, refusing interviews and maintaining silence about his wartime experiences for several years. In 1958, he published his memoirs, 10 Years and 20 Days, in which he portrayed himself as a loyal naval officer who had simply done his duty. The book was controversial for its complete lack of acknowledgement of Nazi crimes and its self-justifying tone. Dönitz claimed he had no knowledge of the Holocaust or other atrocities, a claim that defies credibility given his position in Hitler's inner circle and his presence at numerous high-level conferences where such matters were discussed. He remained unrepentant about his service to Hitler, arguing that as a military man, he had no responsibility for political decisions. This stance alienated him from many former officers who had come to terms with Germany's past, but it endeared him to unreconstructed Nazis who saw him as a symbol of continued resistance to accepting guilt. Dönitz lived until December 24, 1980, dying at the age of 89 from a heart attack. He was the last surviving member of Hitler's inner circle, and his death marked the end of an era. His funeral attracted both veterans who honoured his naval service and protesters who condemned his Nazi past, reflecting ongoing debates about how to remember Wehrmacht officers. Walter von Brauchitsch commanded the German army as commander-in-chief from 1938 to 1941, during some of the Wehrmacht's greatest victories and most catastrophic failures. Born into a military family on October 4, 1881 in Berlin, Brauchitsch followed in the footsteps of his forefathers, building a career in the German army that spanned both world wars. His family's military tradition extended back generations, giving him both prestige and expectations to uphold. Brauchitsch served as an artillery officer during World War I, demonstrating competence that led to his retention in the reduced Reichswehr after Germany's defeat. During the interwar years, he rose steadily through the ranks, benefiting from the patronage of senior officers who valued his technical expertise and aristocratic connections. By 1938, Brauchitsch had reached the rank of Colonel General and appeared destined for high command. But his personal life complicated matters. He was unhappily married and wished to divorce his wife to marry a younger woman, Charlotte Rufer, who was an enthusiastic Nazi. Hitler saw an opportunity in Brauchitsch's marital difficulties, offering to facilitate the expensive divorce in exchange for absolute loyalty and support for his military plans. Hitler personally provided 80,000 Reichsmarks to help Brauchitsch settle with his first wife, creating a financial obligation that compromised the general's independence. This arrangement exemplified Hitler's method of controlling senior officers through a combination of bribery, flattery, and exploitation of personal weaknesses. As commander-in-chief of the German army, Brauchitsch oversaw the successful Blitzkrieg, campaigns of 1939 and 1940 that conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with shocking speed. These victories were primarily the result of innovative tactics developed by younger officers like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, but Brauchitsch received credit as the formal commander. His role was largely administrative, coordinating the various army groups and implementing strategies developed by others. Brauchitsch's relationship with Hitler was always troubled by the Führer's increasing interference in military matters. Hitler attended planning sessions and frequently overruled professional military advice based on his own intuitions and political considerations. Brauchitsch lacked the strength of character to effectively resist Hitler's meddling, often implementing orders he knew were militarily unsound rather than risk confrontation. This weakness became particularly problematic during the planning and execution of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Brauchitsch expressed private doubts about the operation's feasibility, but raised no serious objections in planning meetings. The initial invasion achieved spectacular tactical successes, with German forces advancing hundreds of miles into Soviet territory and capturing millions of prisoners, but strategic confusion undermined these gains. Hitler's insistence on diverting forces from the drive toward Moscow to secure economic objectives in Ukraine frustrated Brauchitsch and other generals who believed capturing the Soviet capital should be the priority. The delay allowed the Soviets to strengthen Moscow's defenses and prepare for winter warfare, ultimately dooming the German offensive. Brauchitsch's health deteriorated under the stress of command and conflict with Hitler, and he suffered a serious heart attack in November 1941, just as the offensive against Moscow was grinding to a halt. The failure of Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow, coincided with Soviet counteroffensives that drove German forces back from the capital in the first major German defeat of the war. Hitler, furious at the setback and looking for scapegoats, dismissed Brauchitsch on December 19, 1941, replacing him with himself as nominal commander-in-chief of the army. This decision marked a crucial turning point, as Hitler would henceforth exercise direct control over military operations, with catastrophic consequences for Germany. Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his estate, effectively sidelined from any meaningful role. He witnessed the gradual destruction of the Wehrmacht he had once commanded, powerless to influence events. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, British forces arrested Brauchitsch in August 1945 on charges of war crimes related to his command of the army during the invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union. The prosecution planned to try him for his role in implementing criminal orders, including the Commissar Order directing the execution of Soviet political officers and various directives authorizing harsh treatment of civilians in occupied territories. Brauchitsch's signature appeared on documents transmitting these orders to field commanders, making him potentially liable for their implementation. However, his poor health complicated plans for prosecution. Brauchitsch was held in custody for 3 years while prosecutors prepared their case, but his deteriorating physical condition raised questions about whether he would survive to stand trial. The stress of imprisonment, combined with his existing heart problems and advancing age, left him increasingly frail. On October 18, 1948, just as he was set to face prosecution, Walter von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia in Hamburg Military Hospital at the age of 67. His death before trial meant he never had to answer for his actions in a court of law, joining other senior Nazi figures who escaped formal judgment through death. Brauchitsch's death raised important questions about justice and accountability for high-ranking military leaders who had implemented Hitler's criminal policies. Unlike political leaders whose ideological commitment to Nazism was clear, professional military officers like Brauchitsch claimed they had simply followed orders and maintained traditional military discipline. This defense, rejected at Nuremberg, nevertheless resonated with some observers who wanted to separate the Wehrmacht's actions from Nazi political crimes. Brauchitsch's case was particularly complex because he had clearly opposed some of Hitler's decisions and had been dismissed for his perceived failures, suggesting some distance from the regime. However, his implementation of criminal orders and his role in planning aggressive wars made him criminally liable regardless of his personal reservations. The fact that he died before trial meant these legal and moral questions could not be resolved through judicial proceedings. His widow and family faced limited consequences, as Brauchitsch had been out of power for years before the war's end and had never achieved the same level of infamy as other Nazi leaders. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never have to answer for his actions, leaving historians to debate his degree of culpability without the clarity that a trial might have provided. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb was one of Germany's most capable field marshals, but his military skill could not erase his complicity in war crimes committed under his command. Born on September 5, 1876, in Passau, Bavaria, Leeb came from a military family and entered the Bavarian army in 1895. He served with distinction during World War I, where he demonstrated tactical ability and earned several medals, including the prestigious Military Order of Max Joseph, which granted him a noble title and allowed him to add Ritter von to his name, changing his surname from Leeb to Ritter von Leeb. During the Weimar Republic, Leeb remained in the army and continued to advance through the ranks, though he was known as a conservative officer who maintained some distance from Nazi politics. He was among the generals who opposed Hitler's aggressive foreign policy in the late 1930s, fearing that Germany was not ready for major war. In 1938, Leeb was involved in preliminary discussions about a possible coup against Hitler if he persisted in risking war over Czechoslovakia, though nothing came of these plans after the Munich Agreement gave Hitler what he wanted without fighting. Despite his reservations about Nazi policies, Leeb continued to serve the regime and commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, where his forces broke through the Maginot Line and contributed to France's rapid defeat. His success in France earned Leeb promotion to Field Marshal in July 1940, making him one of the Wehrmacht's most senior officers. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, in June 1941, Leeb commanded Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states and capturing Leningrad. The campaign began with spectacular success, as German forces covered hundreds of miles in weeks and trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in vast encirclements. However, Leeb's forces were soon involved in implementing some of the war's worst atrocities. On March 30, 1941, Leeb had attended the infamous speech where Hitler outlined his vision for an ideological war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, explicitly calling for the murder of communist officials, political commissars, and the Jewish population. Leeb raised no objections to this criminal program and subsequently transmitted orders to his subordinates directing cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads responsible for mass executions behind the front lines. Under Leeb's command, Army Group North cooperated closely with Einsatzgruppen units that murdered tens of thousands of Jews in the Baltic states and Russia. His forces provided logistical support, intelligence, and sometimes direct participation in these massacres. Leeb personally transmitted the Barbarossa Decree, which suspended legal protections for Soviet civilians and authorized German soldiers to commit violence without fear of prosecution. This order created conditions for widespread atrocities, as troops understood they could kill, rape, and plunder with impunity. The Siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 under Leeb's command, represented one of World War II's greatest humanitarian catastrophes. Rather than attempting to capture the city through assault, which would have been costly in German casualties, Leeb implemented a siege strategy designed to starve the population into submission. German forces cut off all supply routes to the city and subjected it to constant artillery bombardment, deliberately targeting civilian areas and food supplies. Hitler's orders explicitly stated that Leningrad should be starved and bombed into rubble, and Leeb implemented these orders without protest. Over the next 2.5 years, more than 1 million civilians died in Leningrad from starvation, disease, and bombardment, one of the worst atrocities in human history. While Leeb was not in command for most of the siege, having been dismissed in January 1942, he bore direct responsibility for establishing the siege and initiating the starvation policy. Leeb's dismissal came after he repeatedly requested permission to withdraw from exposed positions in front of Leningrad, as Soviet counterattacks threatened to encircle German forces. Hitler refused these requests, insisting that German troops hold their positions regardless of the cost. On January 15, 1942, Leeb requested that Hitler either grant him autonomy in his command or relieve him of his duties, essentially challenging Hitler's interference in tactical decisions. Hitler chose to relieve him, and Leeb was replaced by Georg von Kuchler. Leeb spent the remainder of the war in retirement at his estate in Bavaria, never receiving another command despite his military reputation. After Germany's surrender, American forces arrested Lieb and held him for trial as a war criminal. At the High Command trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings focused on military leaders, Lieb faced charges related to war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of his role in transmitting criminal orders, cooperating with death squads, and implementing policies that resulted in mass murder of civilians and prisoners of war. Lieb's defense attorney portrayed him as a humane soldier who had merely transmitted orders from higher authority and had no direct involvement in specific atrocities. The defense argued that Lieb had opposed some of Hitler's policies and had been dismissed for his unwillingness to blindly follow orders, suggesting he maintained professional independence. However, the documentary evidence contradicted this narrative, showing Lieb had faithfully implemented criminal directives and had cooperated with the SS in carrying out mass murder. The court convicted Lieb of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and crimes committed by units under his command, though it acquitted him of some charges due to lack of direct evidence linking him to specific incidents. On October 28, 1948, Wilhelm von Leeb was sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment, effectively time served, as he had already been in custody since 1945. The surprisingly lenient sentence shocked many observers and reflected tensions in the early Cold War period, as American authorities began viewing former Wehrmacht officers as potential allies against the Soviet Union, rather than simply as war criminals. Lieb was released from prison immediately after sentencing and returned to his estate at Hohenschwangau in Bavaria. Despite his light punishment, he had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime during the war, including secret gifts of 250,000 Reichsmarks and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks, rewards for his loyalty and service. After his release, Lieb lived quietly in Bavaria, largely avoiding public attention and rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. He maintained contact with other former Wehrmacht officers and participated in veterans organizations that promoted a sanitized version of the military's war record. Lieb died following a heart attack on April 29, 1956, at the age of 79. His case exemplifies the complexities and failures of post-war accountability, where professional military competence and Cold War political considerations sometimes outweighed clear evidence of war crimes. The light sentence Lieb received stood in sharp contrast to the harsh punishment meted out to political leaders and SS officers, reflecting an artificial distinction between clean Wehrmacht operations and Nazi atrocities. This distinction would persist for decades before historians thoroughly documented the German military's deep complicity in genocide and other war crimes. Lieb's widow inherited his estate and pension, living comfortably until her death, benefiting from wealth accumulated through service to a criminal regime. Georg von Kuchler succeeded Lieb as commander of Army Group North and shared responsibility for the continued siege of Leningrad. Born on May 30, 1881, in Philippsruhe, near Hanau, Kuchler joined the German army in 1900 and served during World War I, where he gained experience in artillery operations. During the interwar years, he specialized in artillery tactics and doctrine, contributing to the development of techniques that would be employed during World War II. Kuchler commanded the 18th Army during the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the invasion of France in 1940, demonstrating competence in handling large formations. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Kuchler commanded the 18th Army as part of Army Group North, participating in the advance toward Leningrad. His forces were deeply involved in implementing criminal policies in the occupied territories, including cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, death squads, and harsh treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. In January 1942, when Lieb was dismissed, Hitler promoted Kuchler to command Army Group North, making him responsible for continuing the siege of Leningrad and defending a vast front against Soviet counterattacks. Under Kuchler's command, the siege of Leningrad continued with unrelenting brutality. German forces maintained their stranglehold on the city, preventing food and supplies from reaching the desperate population while subjecting them to constant bombardment. Kuchler personally approved plans for the siege's continuation and rejected proposals to allow civilian evacuation, following Hitler's directive that Leningrad must be destroyed utterly. The siege would not be fully lifted until January 1944, more than 2 years after Kuchler took command, and by then over 1 million civilians had died. Kuchler's forces also implemented harsh anti-partisan measures in occupied territories behind the front lines, carrying out reprisal killings and destroying entire villages suspected of supporting Soviet resistance fighters. His headquarters issued orders authorizing extreme violence against civilians and explicitly directed cooperation with SS units engaged in mass murder. Documents from his command show Kuchler was fully aware of the atrocities being committed under his authority and actively facilitated them through provision of troops, logistics, and intelligence. By early 1944, Soviet forces had built up overwhelming strength and launched massive offensives that drove German forces back from Leningrad and threatened to destroy Army Group North entirely. Kuchler requested permission to conduct strategic withdrawals to shorter defensive lines, but Hitler refused, insisting that every meter of ground must be held. The inflexibility of these orders led to catastrophic losses, as Soviet forces encircled and destroyed German formations that could have escaped if allowed to retreat earlier. On January 29, 1944, after failing to halt the Soviet offensive and violating Hitler's stand-fast orders by authorizing limited withdrawals, Kuchler was relieved of command and replaced by Walter Model. He was forcibly retired from active service and spent the final year of the war in limbo, holding no position and with his future uncertain. During his retirement, Kuchler was approached by members of the resistance plotting to overthrow Hitler, but he declined to participate, unwilling to commit treason despite his personal doubts about Hitler's leadership. When the war ended in May 1945, American forces arrested Kuchler and held him for trial. At the High Command trial, Kuchler faced charges of war, crimes against humanity for his role in the siege of Leningrad, the murder of Soviet prisoners of war, and cooperation with death squads. The prosecution presented damning evidence of his direct involvement in criminal operations, including orders he had signed directing the mistreatment of prisoners and civilians. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence showed Kuchler had authorized the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories, implementing the Nazi euthanasia program in areas under military control. During the proceedings, Kuchler attempted to minimize his responsibility by attributing harsh conditions in POW camps to winter weather and supply shortages, describing prisoner deaths as an act of God rather than the result of deliberate policy. He claimed the German army had exaggerated POW mortality rates to obtain more supplies, attempting to shift blame away from the systematic murder of Soviet prisoners. The court rejected these arguments, finding overwhelming evidence that Kuchler had knowingly implemented policies designed to kill prisoners and civilians. On October 28, 1948, the tribunal convicted Georg von Kuchler and sentenced him to 20 years imprisonment for his war crimes. This sentence, while more substantial than Lieb's, still seemed lenient given the scale of suffering caused by his actions. In 1951, American authorities reviewed the sentences of High Command trial defendants and reduced Kuchler's sentence to 12 years as part of a broader amnesty program influenced by Cold War politics and pressure from West German officials. This reduction was controversial, with critics arguing that military officers were receiving preferential treatment compared to other war criminals. In February 1953, after serving less than 8 years, Kuchler was released from prison and went to live with his wife in the Garmisch region of Bavaria. He lived quietly in retirement, avoiding public attention and maintaining contact with other former Wehrmacht officers through veterans organizations. Kuchler never publicly expressed remorse for his actions and maintained that he had simply done his duty as a soldier. He died in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968, at the age of 86, having lived for 15 years after his release from prison. His case, like Lieb's, illustrated the incomplete nature of post-war justice for Wehrmacht commanders. While both men were convicted and imprisoned, their relatively brief sentences and comfortable retirements seemed inadequate punishment for their roles in some of the war's worst atrocities. The lenient treatment of military leaders compared to political and SS leaders reflected Cold War priorities and a reluctance to fully confront the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes. This failure to achieve complete accountability would have lasting consequences for how Germany remembered and reckoned with its past, allowing myths about the clean. Wehrmacht to persist for decades despite overwhelming evidence of military participation in genocide and other war crimes. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist was one of Germany's most skilled panzer commanders, whose tactical brilliance on the battlefield could not excuse his complicity in war crimes. Born on August 8, 1881, in Braunfels, Germany, von Kleist came from a family with a long history of military service stretching back centuries. He joined the Imperial German Army in 1900 and served as a cavalry officer during World War I, where he gained valuable experience in mobile warfare. During the interwar years, Kleist adapted to mechanized warfare and became an advocate for armored tactics, understanding how tanks could revolutionize military operations. When World War II began, he commanded the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in May 1940, leading a fast-moving armoured thrust that penetrated deep into French defences and contributed decisively to Germany's stunning victory. His panzer forces raced through the Ardennes forest, crossed the Meuse River, and drove toward the English Channel, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied troops in a massive encirclement. This success established von Kleist's reputation as one of Germany's premier armoured commanders and earned him the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honours. In 1941, von Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Army during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, where he led some of the largest tank battles in history. His forces participated in the massive encirclements at Uman and Kiev that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and appeared to open the path to total German victory. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 was particularly devastating for the Soviets, with more than 650,000 soldiers captured in what remains one of the largest military disasters in history. Von Kleist's Panzer Army worked in coordination with infantry forces to close the encirclement and prevent Soviet escape, though the operation delayed the drive toward Moscow and may have cost Germany its chance to capture the Soviet capital before winter. Despite these tactical successes, Kleist's campaigns in the Soviet Union revealed the limits of German military strategy. Logistical challenges plagued German forces as they advanced hundreds of miles from their supply bases, and the harsh Russian winter of 1941-1942 caught German troops unprepared, lacking proper winter clothing and equipment. Von Kleist's forces suffered heavy losses from cold, disease, and Soviet counterattacks, but they maintained cohesion better than some other German formations due to his leadership. In 1942, von Kleist was appointed commander of Army Group A during the German summer offensive into the Caucasus, tasked with capturing the vital oil fields that Hitler believed would fuel Germany's war machine. The offensive initially made rapid progress, with German forces advancing deep into the Caucasus Mountains and approaching the oil fields around Baku. However, the campaign faltered due to overextended supply lines, fierce Soviet resistance, and Hitler's decision to divert resources to the simultaneous offensive towards Stalingrad. By early 1943, with German forces trapped at Stalingrad and facing disaster, Army Group A was forced into a hasty retreat from the Caucasus to avoid being cut off. This retreat marked a turning point in the war, as Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Von Kleist continued to command Army Group A, later redesignated Army Group South Ukraine, in defensive battles against relentless Soviet offensives. Despite his tactical skill, he could not prevent the gradual Soviet reconquest of occupied territories. On March 30, 1944, after a series of retreats and defensive failures that reflected German weakness rather than his incompetence, Hitler dismissed von Kleist from command. Hitler increasingly distrusted his military commanders, particularly aristocratic officers like Kleist, whom he suspected of lacking ideological commitment, and he sought scapegoats for Germany's deteriorating military position. Following the unsuccessful July 20, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler, the Gestapo arrested von Kleist due to his cousin's involvement in the conspiracy. While Kleist himself had not participated in the plot and had no foreknowledge of it, his family connection made him suspect in the paranoid atmosphere following the bombing. Despite the arrest, Kleist managed to avoid trial, possibly due to lack of concrete evidence against him personally, and he was eventually released. He spent the final months of the war in limbo, holding no position and uncertain of his future. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied forces captured von Kleist and initially held him for potential prosecution. However, rather than trying him themselves, American authorities extradited him to Yugoslavia. where he was wanted for war crimes committed during the German occupation of that country in 1941. Yugoslav courts sentenced Kleist to 15 years in prison for crimes including reprisal executions of civilians, destruction of villages, and cooperation with occupation forces in suppressing partisan resistance. He served several years in Yugoslav prisons under harsh conditions before being extradited again, this time to the Soviet Union. In Soviet custody, von Kleist faced new charges related to his command on the Eastern Front, including participation in mass murder of civilians, mistreatment of prisoners of war, and implementation of scorched earth policies during retreats. Soviet military tribunals were generally less concerned with legal niceties than Western courts, and von Kleist's trial focused on collective German guilt rather than his specific actions. On October 23, 1952, a Soviet military tribunal sentenced von Kleist to 25 years in a correctional labor camp, a sentence that at his age amounted to life imprisonment. He was sent to Vladimir Central Prison, a notorious facility where many high-ranking German officers and other war criminals were held in brutal conditions. The prison was overcrowded, cold, and disease-ridden, with inadequate food and medical care. Von Kleist's health deteriorated rapidly in captivity, and he suffered from various ailments including heart problems. On November 13, 1954, at the age of 73, Paul Ludwig von Kleist died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison. He was one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody, and his death received little attention in the West, where many had forgotten about him during his decade of imprisonment behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets buried him in an unmarked grave, and his family learned of his death only months later. Von Kleist's case illustrated the varying fates that awaited German military leaders, depending on who captured them, and what political calculations influenced their treatment. Unlike generals captured by Western allies who often received relatively lenient sentences and early releases, those handed over to Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union faced harsh punishment and died in captivity. This disparity reflected not just different judicial standards, but also the different experiences of Eastern and Western populations under German occupation. Soviet citizens and Yugoslavs had suffered far more devastating German atrocities than Western Europeans, creating demands for severe punishment that their governments could not ignore. Von Kleist's family received no remains to bury and no pension, as his property had been confiscated and his military service dishonoured. His fate served as a reminder that tactical brilliance on the battlefield could not erase responsibility for serving a criminal regime and implementing its brutal policies. Wilhelm List was another field marshal whose competent military leadership was overshadowed by his role in occupation atrocities. Born on May 14, 1880, in Oberkirchberg, Germany, List joined the Bavarian Army in 1898 and served with distinction during World War I, rising to command a battalion. During the Weimar Republic years, List remained in the Reichswehr and continued to advance through the ranks, becoming a protégé of influential senior officers. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, List commanded an army group during the invasion of Poland, where his forces achieved rapid success in overrunning Polish defences. His performance in Poland earned him Hitler's favour, and by July 1940, he was promoted to Field Marshal. List's most notable assignment came in 1941, when he commanded Army Group A during the Balkan Campaign, leading German forces in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. These operations were militarily successful, with German forces quickly overcoming resistance and occupying both countries within weeks. However, the occupation of the Balkans became notorious for brutal repression, mass executions, and harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians. While List himself did not remain in the Balkans after the initial conquest, his forces established the occupation regime and participated in early atrocities that set the pattern for subsequent German conduct in the region. In 1942, List returned to operational command when Hitler appointed him to lead the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front, known as Case Blue. The operation aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and destroy Soviet forces in southern Russia, objectives Hitler considered essential for Germany's continued ability to wage war. List commanded Army Group A, which was tasked with the main drive into the Caucasus, while Army Group B under General von Weichs attacked towards Stalingrad. The offensive began well, with German forces advancing rapidly and inflicting heavy losses on Soviet defenders. However, problems soon emerged as German forces became overextended, with inadequate logistics to support operations hundreds of miles from their bases. List faced conflicting priorities as Hitler constantly changed objectives, first demanding maximum speed toward the oil fields, then diverting forces to support other operations, then insisting on capturing specific geographic points that had little military value. The frequent changes in orders disrupted operational planning and dispersed German strength, making it impossible to achieve decisive results. By late August 1942, List's offensive had stalled, with German forces unable to reach the most important oil fields around Baku, despite advancing deep into the Caucasus Mountains. Hitler, frustrated by the slow progress and looking for scapegoats, subjected List to increasingly harsh criticism and micromanagement. During one particularly contentious conference, Hitler berated List for his cautious approach and demanded more aggressive action regardless of the risks. List attempted to explain the practical difficulties his forces faced, including mountainous terrain, Soviet resistance, and logistical constraints, but Hitler dismissed these concerns as defeatist. On September 9, 1942, Hitler dismissed List from command, ending his military career. The dismissal was unjust, as List had performed competently under impossible conditions created by Hitler's interference, but it reflected the Führer's pattern of blaming generals for failures caused by his own strategic errors. After his dismissal, List never returned to active duty and spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement. Unlike some dismissed generals who were rehabilitated when Germany's military situation became desperate, List was never recalled, possibly because Hitler held personal animosity toward him. Following Germany's defeat in May 1945, Allied forces arrested List and held him for trial as a war criminal. At the hostages trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, List faced charges related to war crimes committed in the Balkans during and after the 1941 invasion. The prosecution presented evidence that German forces under List's command had executed hostages, destroyed villages, and committed numerous atrocities against civilians in Yugoslavia and Greece. While List had not personally ordered many of these crimes, he bore command responsibility for the actions of his subordinates and had failed to prevent or punish atrocities committed by troops under his authority. List's defense argued that he had opposed excessive violence and had attempted to moderate the worst excesses of occupation policy. Witnesses testified that List had sometimes intervened to prevent planned reprisals or had sought to minimize casualties among civilian populations. However, the documentary evidence showed that while List may have opposed some extreme measures, he had implemented occupation policies that violated the laws of war and had tolerated criminal conduct by his subordinates. The tribunal recognized that List operated under pressure from higher authorities who demanded harsh action against resistance movements, but it held that command responsibility could not be evaded by claiming superior orders. On February 19, 1948, the court convicted Wilhelm List and sentenced him to life imprisonment for war crimes committed in the Balkans. This sentence acknowledged the severity of his crimes while recognizing some mitigating factors in his conduct. However, List would not serve his full sentence. In 1953, American authorities released him on grounds of ill health, a decision that sparked controversy given that he had served only 5 years of a life sentence. Critics argued that elderly German generals were receiving preferential treatment and early release, while their victims remained dead. Supporters of the release claimed that List's poor health made continued imprisonment inhumane and that he posed no threat to society. After his release, Wilhelm List lived quietly in the Garmisch region of Bavaria, the same area where other former generals had settled. He avoided public statements about his wartime experiences and maintained a low profile, though he remained in contact with other former Wehrmacht officers through veterans organizations. List lived for nearly 2 more decades after his release, dying on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91, having outlived most of his contemporaries from the Nazi era. His longevity after release from prison contrasted sharply with his claims of poor health that had justified his early release, leading to accusations that medical grounds had been exaggerated to secure his freedom. List's case exemplified the broader pattern of German military leaders receiving relatively lenient treatment compared to political and SS leaders, reflecting ongoing debates about the Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes. The fact that he lived comfortably for nearly 20 years after receiving a life sentence for war crimes illustrated the incomplete nature of post-war justice and the ways in which Cold War politics influenced decisions about punishment and clemency for war criminals. The victims of atrocities committed under his command received no such mercy, and their families gained no real closure from his brief imprisonment and long, comfortable retirement. The collective fates of Hitler's inner circle paint a picture of delayed and incomplete justice. While the major trials at Nuremberg established important legal precedents and documented Nazi crimes for history, the actual punishment of perpetrators varied wildly, based on factors often unrelated to the severity of their crimes. Political leaders and those directly involved in implementing the Holocaust generally faced harsh punishment, with most being executed or receiving long prison sentences. Military leaders, particularly those from the Wehrmacht rather than the SS, often received more lenient treatment, with some avoiding prosecution entirely and others receiving sentences that were later reduced or commuted. This disparity reflected both Cold War politics and lingering respect for military professionalism that prevented full reckoning with the armed forces' complicity in genocide and aggressive war. The varying outcomes also demonstrated the practical difficulties of achieving justice on such a massive scale, with thousands of perpetrators and millions of victims making comprehensive accountability impossible. Many lower-ranking officials and participants in atrocities escaped punishment entirely, either because evidence was lacking, because they successfully fled to countries that would not extradite them, or because Allied priorities shifted from punishment to reconstruction and Cold War competition. Joachim von Ribbentrop served as Hitler's foreign minister and was one of the most despised figures in the Nazi hierarchy. Born Joachim Ribbentrop on April 30, 1893, in Wessel, Germany, he added the aristocratic von to his name through an adoption arranged by an aunt, a piece of social climbing that typified his character. Ribbentrop spent time in Canada before World War I, where he worked in business and learned English, skills that would later prove useful in his diplomatic career. During World War I, he served in the German army, though not with particular distinction. After the war, Ribbentrop became a successful wine merchant, marrying into a wealthy champagne-producing family and establishing himself in high society. He joined the Nazi Party relatively late in 1932, but quickly ingratiated himself with Hitler by offering his social connections and international business contacts. Hitler, who initially viewed Ribbentrop as useful for accessing elite circles that disdained the rougher Nazi leaders, appointed him as his foreign policy advisor. Ribbentrop's pompous manner and limited intelligence made him unpopular with other Nazi leaders who mocked him behind his back. Goebbels' diaries are filled with contemptuous references to Ribbentrop's arrogance and incompetence. Despite widespread contempt from colleagues, Ribbentrop's slavish devotion to Hitler ensured his continued rise. He served as ambassador to Britain from 1936 to 1938, where he completely misread British politics and assured Hitler that Britain would never go to war over Poland. His tenure in London was marked by diplomatic gaffes, including giving the Hitler salute at a meeting with King George VI and making offensive comments about British decline. British officials found him insufferable, with one diplomat describing him as combining the perfidy of the Italians with the brutality of the Germans. When he returned to Berlin in 1938 to become foreign minister, replacing the more cautious Konstantin von Neurath, Ribbentrop pursued an aggressive foreign policy that aligned perfectly with Hitler's expansionist goals. He negotiated the Pact of Steel with Italy in 1939, strengthening the Rome-Berlin axis, and most significantly he travelled to Moscow in August 1939 to sign the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement stunned the world, as it allied two ideologically opposed regimes and included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. The pact gave Hitler the freedom to attack Poland without fearing Soviet intervention, directly enabling the outbreak of World War II. Ribbentrop's role extended beyond traditional diplomacy into the realm of war crimes. He pressured satellite states to deport their Jewish populations to German-controlled territories, where they would be murdered in concentration camps. In 1942, he sent a circular to German embassies instructing them to press Allied and occupied governments to hand over Jews for deportation, explicitly stating this was part of the final solution. His ministry coordinated with the SS on implementing anti-Jewish policies across occupied Europe. Ribbentrop personally approved measures that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, signing off on deportation orders and supporting policies of starvation and mass murder. As foreign minister, he also bore responsibility for Germany's rejection of peace overtures and its continuation of the war long past the point where defeat was inevitable. He consistently told Hitler what he wanted to hear, assuring him that Britain and America would eventually tire of the war and seek peace, encouraging Hitler's delusions even as German cities burned under Allied bombing. By 1943, Ribbentrop had lost much of his influence as Hitler increasingly bypassed the foreign ministry in favour of military and party channels, but he clung to his position and continued to facilitate Nazi policies. In the final weeks of the war, Ribbentrop remained nominally in his position but was completely powerless. He attempted to flee to Hamburg as the Soviets approached Berlin, but was captured by British forces on June 14, 1945, hiding in a boarding house under a false name. At Nuremberg, Ribbentrop proved to be one of the least effective defendants, his testimony rambling and unconvincing. He denied knowledge of the Holocaust despite overwhelming documentary evidence of his ministry's involvement in implementing the final solution. When confronted with his signature on deportation orders, he claimed he had merely been following Hitler's instructions and had no idea what would happen to the deported Jews. This defense satisfied no one, and the prosecution easily demonstrated that Ribbentrop had not only known about the mass murder, but had actively facilitated it. His attempts to portray himself as a mere diplomat caught up in events beyond his control were undermined by evidence showing he had enthusiastically promoted aggressive war and genocide. The tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment, including conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death on October 1, 1946. Joachim von Ribbentrop was hanged at Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946, in the early morning hours. He was the first of the condemned men to mount the gallows, and witnesses reported he appeared terrified as he climbed the steps. His last words were, "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany should recover her unity, and that, for the sake of peace, there should be understanding between East and West. I wish peace to the world." The execution was botched, and like Keitel before him, Ribbentrop strangled slowly rather than dying instantly. His body was cremated and the ashes scattered to prevent any memorial. Ribbentrop's wife, Anneliese, and their 5 children survived the war, but faced years of poverty and social ostracism. His son Rudolf later wrote a biography of his father that attempted, without success, to rehabilitate his reputation. The book argued that Ribbentrop had been a man of peace trapped in a regime he could not control, a claim thoroughly refuted by historical evidence. Ribbentrop's case exemplifies the dangers of appointing sycophants to positions of power, as his incompetence and willingness to tell Hitler only what he wanted to hear contributed to catastrophic policy decisions that cost millions of lives. Hans Frank served as Governor-General of occupied Poland and earned the nickname Butcher of Poland for his brutal administration. Born on May 23, 1900, in Karlsruhe, Germany, Frank studied law and joined the Nazi Party in 1927, becoming Hitler's personal lawyer. He defended the party in numerous court cases during the 1920s and early 1930s, using legal technicalities and aggressive tactics to protect Nazi leaders from prosecution for their violent activities. His legal acumen made him valuable to the movement, and after the Nazis took power in 1933, Frank was appointed Minister of Justice for Bavaria and, later, Reich Minister without portfolio. He founded the Academy for German Law, which worked to align the legal system with Nazi ideology, stripping away protections for minorities and political opponents. Frank believed law should serve the racial state rather than protect individual rights, a philosophy that justified countless atrocities. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler appointed Frank Governor-General of the occupied Polish territories not directly annexed to Germany. This position gave Frank nearly unlimited power over millions of Polish citizens, power he used with shocking cruelty. Frank's administration of Poland was characterized by systematic exploitation, cultural destruction, and mass murder. He implemented policies designed to reduce the Polish population to slavery, closing universities, executing intellectuals, and destroying cultural institutions. Frank openly stated his goal was to eliminate the Polish educated class and reduce the remaining population to illiterate labourers serving German interests. Under his rule, hundreds of thousands of Poles were executed, millions were sent to forced labour camps in Germany, and countless others starved due to confiscation of food supplies. Frank's territory included most of Poland's Jewish population, and he played a central role in implementing the Holocaust in Poland. He established the Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin, Radom, and Galicia ghettos, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were confined in horrific conditions before being transported to death camps. Frank's diaries, which he meticulously maintained throughout the war, contain numerous references to the murder of Jews, including a notorious December 1941 entry where he discussed the impossibility of killing all the Jews through shooting and the need for other methods. These diaries, seized by American forces at the end of the war, provided devastating evidence against him at trial. Despite his crimes, Frank lived lavishly in Krakow's Wawel Castle, surrounded by art treasures looted from Polish collections. He styled himself as a Renaissance prince, hosting elaborate parties and concerts even as people starved in the streets below. His corruption was notorious even among other Nazi officials, and he amassed a personal fortune through theft and extortion. By 1942, Frank had begun to have doubts about Germany's ultimate victory and the morality of Nazi policies, though these doubts did not translate into any reduction in atrocities. In 1942, he gave a series of lectures in which he suggested that law should be based on justice rather than pure power, comments that were seen as veiled criticism of Hitler's rule. These speeches infuriated Hitler, who considered removing Frank from his position, but ultimately decided to leave him in place, as removing him might create instability in the occupation administration. Frank's later claims that he had resisted Nazi policies from within were thoroughly disproved by his own diaries and the testimony of witnesses who described his enthusiastic participation in mass murder. American forces captured Frank in May 1945, and he immediately offered his diaries to his captors, apparently believing they would show him in a favourable light. Instead, they provided some of the most damning evidence presented at any of the war crimes trials. At Nuremberg, Frank underwent a dramatic transformation, converting to Catholicism and expressing remorse for his crimes in a way that seemed genuine to some observers. He testified openly about his knowledge of atrocities and accepted responsibility for the suffering of the Polish people, though he attempted to blame Hitler for giving the orders he had merely implemented. His defense argued that he had tried to protect Poles from even worse treatment and had opposed some of Hitler's most extreme demands, claims that his own diaries contradicted. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Frank's direct involvement in planning and executing genocidal policies, including his signatures on orders for mass executions and deportations. Witnesses testified about his brutal statements and his personal approval of specific atrocities. Despite his apparent conversion and expressions of remorse, the tribunal found his crimes so extensive and his role so central that mercy was impossible. Hans Frank was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death on October 1, 1946. He was hanged at Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946. His final words included a prayer and a request for God's mercy on Germany. After his execution, his wife Brigitte and their 5 children, including his son Nicholas, faced a difficult future in post-war Germany. Nicholas Frank, born in 1939, would later become one of the most vocal critics of his father's legacy, spending decades confronting the horror of being the child of a mass murderer. He wrote several books condemning his father's actions and refused to forgive or excuse the crimes committed. Nicholas Frank's brutal honesty about hating his father stood in stark contrast to other children of Nazi leaders who defended their parents or remained silent. His work educating about the Holocaust and speaking openly about his father's guilt represented a form of moral courage rare among descendants of perpetrators. Hans Frank's case demonstrated that even those who expressed remorse and acknowledged their crimes could not escape the consequences of their actions, and his execution was broadly supported as just punishment for his role in one of history's greatest atrocities. Ernst Kaltenbrunner succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as head of the Reich Security Main Office and was the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial at Nuremberg. Born on October 4, 1903, in Riedem-Innkreis, Austria, Kaltenbrunner studied law and became an early Austrian Nazi, joining the party in 1932 when it was still illegal in Austria. His imposing physical presence, standing 6 feet 7 inches tall with a scarred face from dueling, made him an intimidating figure. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Kaltenbrunner was appointed State Secretary for Security in Austria, beginning his rise through the SS hierarchy. When Heydrich was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942, Himmler appointed Kaltenbrunner to succeed him as head of the RSHA, the organization that controlled the Gestapo, SD, and criminal police. This position made Kaltenbrunner responsible for implementing the final solution, running the concentration camp system and directing security operations across occupied Europe. Kaltenbrunner oversaw the murder of millions of people through his control of the extermination camps and death squads. He personally signed orders for mass executions, approved deportation lists, and directed the suppression of resistance movements through terror. His authority extended to deciding who would live and who would die in occupied territories, and he exercised this power with ruthless efficiency. Kaltenbrunner was also involved in the murder of prisoners of war, ordering the execution of Allied airmen who had parachuted from damaged aircraft and supervising the killing of Soviet POWs. In the final months of the war, he attempted to destroy evidence of Nazi crimes, ordering the murder of concentration camp inmates who might serve as witnesses, and the destruction of records documenting atrocities. When captured by American troops in May 1945, Kaltenbrunner initially denied his identity, but his height and distinctive scars made disguise impossible. At Nuremberg, he mounted a defense claiming he had merely been an administrator with no knowledge of the specific crimes committed by organizations under his command. This defense was absurd given his position and the extensive documentary evidence of his direct involvement in ordering mass murder. The tribunal convicted Ernst Kaltenbrunner of war crimes and crimes against humanity, finding him directly responsible for the deaths of millions. He was sentenced to death and hanged on October 16, 1946, at Nuremberg prison. His execution was particularly difficult, as the hangman had miscalculated the drop needed for his large frame, and he strangled slowly over many minutes. Kaltenbrunner showed no remorse and maintained to the end that he had simply been following orders. His widow and children faced a difficult future, shunned by society and bearing the weight of his crimes. Kaltenbrunner's case illustrated the ultimate consequences awaiting those who implemented genocide, and his conviction established important precedents about individual responsibility for crimes committed through bureaucratic systems. Fritz Sauckel served as general plenipotentiary for labor deployment and was responsible for organizing the forced labor program that enslaved millions of people from occupied territories. Born on October 27, 1894, in Haßfurt, Germany, Sauckel had a working-class background unusual among top Nazi leaders. He went to sea as a merchant sailor and was interned in France during World War I. After the war, he worked in a factory and became active in radical nationalist politics, joining the Nazi Party in 1923. He rose through the party ranks to become Gauleiter of Thuringia, where he demonstrated administrative competence and loyalty to Hitler. In March 1942, Hitler appointed him to organize the recruitment of foreign labor for German industry, a task that would make Sauckel one of the war's greatest criminals. Under Sauckel's direction, approximately 5 million people were forcibly deported from occupied territories to work as slaves in German factories, farms, and mines. The conditions under which these workers labored were horrific, with inadequate food, brutal discipline, and no legal protection. Sauckel issued quotas to occupation authorities demanding specific numbers of workers, and he was indifferent to the methods used to meet these quotas. Villages were surrounded and all able-bodied people seized, families were separated, and those who resisted were shot. The deportations devastated communities across occupied Europe, tearing apart societies and causing immense suffering. Many of those deported died from overwork, starvation, disease, or abuse, and Sauckel bore direct responsibility for their deaths. He worked closely with Albert Speer, whose armaments production depended on the slave labour Sauckel provided, though the two men later tried to blame each other for the worst abuses. At Nuremberg, Sauckel attempted to argue that he had tried to ensure humane treatment of foreign workers and that any abuses were the fault of individual employers. This defence collapsed under evidence showing his knowledge of conditions and his pressure on subordinates to meet quotas regardless of human cost. The tribunal convicted him of crimes against humanity and war crimes, sentencing him to death. Fritz Sauckel was hanged on October 16, 1946, protesting to the end that he had simply been doing his job. His widow and 10 children were left destitute, and his name became synonymous with industrial slavery. Arthur Seyss-Inquart served as Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands and was responsible for the deportation of Dutch Jews and the brutal suppression of Dutch resistance. Born on July 22, 1892, in Stannern, Moravia, in what was then Austria-Hungary, Seyss-Inquart studied law and became active in Austrian nationalist politics. He played a key role in the annexation of Austria to Germany in 1938, serving briefly as Austrian Chancellor before the country was absorbed into the Reich. His reward was appointment as governor of occupied Poland, a position he held briefly before being transferred to the Netherlands in 1940. As Reich Commissioner, Seyss-Inquart implemented Nazi policies with efficiency and ruthlessness. He oversaw the deportation of more than 100,000 Dutch Jews to death camps, introduced forced labour programs and ordered harsh reprisals against resistance activities. When Dutch workers went on strike in 1941 to protest anti-Jewish measures, Seyss-Inquart had the leaders executed and hundreds more arrested. He confiscated vast quantities of food and industrial equipment from the Netherlands to support the German war effort, creating severe shortages that led to widespread malnutrition and thousands of deaths during the hunger winter of 1944-1945. Despite his crimes, Seyss-Inquart maintained cordial relationships with some Dutch officials and claimed to have moderated some of the worst demands from Berlin. However, his own orders and correspondence revealed his active participation in implementing genocidal and exploitative policies. At Nuremberg, he admitted his role in the occupation but argued he had prevented even worse atrocities, a claim undermined by the extensive evidence of his crimes. The tribunal found him guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentencing him to death. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was hanged on October 16, 1946, at Nuremberg prison. His final words expressed no remorse, instead hoping for peace between Germany and other nations. His execution was noted for being one of the few that proceeded without complications, the hangman having finally adjusted his calculations after the bungled earlier executions. Seyss-Inquart's case demonstrated that even those who claimed to have moderated Nazi policies could not escape responsibility for the atrocities they facilitated. Julius Streicher was the publisher of Der Stürmer, the most virulently anti-Semitic newspaper in Nazi Germany, and was the only defendant at Nuremberg convicted primarily for crimes of incitement rather than direct participation in violence. Born on February 12, 1885, in Fleinhausen, Germany, Streicher worked as a teacher before becoming obsessed with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. He joined the Nazi Party early and became one of Hitler's most fanatical supporters, though his vulgarity and obsessive sexual perversions made him an embarrassment even to other Nazis. From 1923 until 1945, Streicher published Der Stürmer, a weekly newspaper filled with grotesque caricatures of Jews and articles promoting anti-Semitic violence. The paper specialized in pornographic stories falsely accusing Jews of ritual murder and sexual crimes, inflaming hatred and preparing the psychological ground for the Holocaust. Streicher had no official government position after 1940, when he was removed as Gauleiter of Franconia due to corruption and erratic behavior, but he continued publishing his newspaper with Hitler's protection. At Nuremberg, Streicher's defense argued that mere propaganda without direct participation in violence should not constitute a crime. The prosecution countered that Streicher's incitement to genocide made him complicit in the millions of murders that followed. Thus, the tribunal agreed, finding that his decades of promoting hatred had contributed to creating the conditions for the Holocaust, and that his continued publication of calls for Jewish extermination during the war made him an accessory to murder. Julius Streicher was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. He was hanged on October 16, 1946, at Nuremberg prison, shouting "Heil Hitler!" as he mounted the scaffold. His execution established the principle that incitement to genocide could itself constitute a crime against humanity, an important precedent in international law. Streicher's widow and children disappeared into obscurity after his death, and his newspaper's extensive archives became evidence of how propaganda can prepare populations for mass violence. The fates of Hitler's inner circle reveal a pattern of attempted escape from justice, followed by varying degrees of accountability. Those who committed suicide, Goring, Himmler, Goebbels, and possibly Bormann, denied the world the satisfaction of seeing them answer for their crimes in court, though their deaths at least ensured they could never rebuild their lives or escape their infamy. Those captured and tried faced the judgment of history at Nuremberg, with most being executed for their roles in humanity's darkest chapter. A few, like Speer and Donitz, escaped execution but served prison terms, using their remaining years to construct self-serving narratives that historians have since demolished. What all these men shared was proximity to absolute power and willingness to use that power in service of evil. Whether motivated by ideology, ambition, or simple obedience, they facilitated genocide and aggressive war that killed tens of millions and left Europe in ruins. The varying fates of these men also revealed inconsistencies in post-war justice. Some, like Lieb and other military commanders, received surprisingly lenient sentences despite clear evidence of war crimes. Others, like Streicher, were executed primarily for propaganda activities that, while morally reprehensible, involved no direct violence. These discrepancies reflected the challenges of establishing legal accountability for crimes committed on such a massive scale, and the difficulty of determining gradations of guilt among thousands of perpetrators. The Nuremberg trials represented an imperfect but crucial effort to establish that individuals could be held responsible for crimes committed in service to a state, rejecting the defense of superior orders and establishing precedents that continue to influence international law. The trials also ensured that the Nazi leadership's crimes were thoroughly documented, making Holocaust denial impossible for honest observers and preserving evidence that continues to educate new generations about the dangers of totalitarianism and racial hatred. The children and families of Hitler's inner circle carried the burden of their father's crimes into the post-war era, with some choosing to confront this legacy, while others retreated into denial or active defense of the indefensible. The varied responses of these descendants, from Niklas Frank's fierce condemnation of his father to Gudrun Himmler's lifelong devotion to her father's memory, illustrate the complex ways in which guilt and responsibility are transmitted across generations. The post-war German society struggled to integrate these families while maintaining accountability for past crimes, a tension that persists in different forms to this day. The story of what happened to Hitler's inner circle after World War II is ultimately a story about justice, accountability, and the consequences of choosing to serve evil. These men who had wielded such terrible power found that power dissolved with defeat, leaving them vulnerable to the judgment they had so long avoided. Whether they died by their own hands, were executed after trial, or served prison sentences, none truly escaped the weight of their crimes. Their fates serve as a reminder that even the mightiest eventually face consequences for their actions, and that history's judgment, while sometimes delayed, ultimately arrives. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to German generals after WW2. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one.